Alright, everyone. Welcome again. This is the Lock One Stop Shop podcast, and it's been a while. And today with me we have Gatto. Say hi to everyone, Gatto.
What's up?
We're going to be talking about, Gatto's with me, we're going to be talking about some Mythic Plus with a couple of European Mythic Plus spammers. We got Atticue from Scrub Busters, looking out his window. There he is. And we also got Shelly. Shelly from Future. He's in Future now. That's pretty good.
Yep.
And they're going to help us out, talk about Mythic Plus, talk about Season 2, talk about why their Warlocks aren't actually a thing in Mythic Plus. Feels bad. Oh, I got sad looks. Alright, anyways. So, today we're going to talk about all that. Starting off with some BlizzCon feedback. I know we didn't really talk about anything during that. There wasn't really anything that went on. Shelly did compete in the Allstars event. That was pretty cool. Anything to say about that?
Not anything else than I think the upcoming upcoming MDI tournaments are going to be really cool and fun to watch, and for anyone competing it's going to be a very pleasant experience. They treated us really nicely at BlizzCon. Overall good.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah, that was really fun to watch. Watch you play Demon Hunter was pretty good.
I did Warlock too.
You did Warlock like once. And did you guys play any vanilla? Anyone excited to get threat capped again? No?
Pretty sure it's only you.
Yeah, it's only me. Alright. Alright, so yeah, that was a thing. It was pretty fun. But we're going to talk mostly about Mythic Plus, the general state of Mythic Plus, and what we're seeing going into Season 2 coming up. So, start off a little bit. This last, during the All-Stars, there was some pretty interesting picks that were going on. Both you and Marvin were playing a lot of not Warlock. Can you go into a little bit as to why range classes in general are kind of getting poo-pooed on?
Yeah, well, first of all, it comes down to not being able to pick the specific comp that you want for every single map. You can only, like, the rules are, at least for this previous All-Stars, that you can only swap one player. Like, one player can swap his class in between each game. So you can't have the healer swap from, let's say the healer wants to play Monk in one map and Disc in the other. Then you have to stick to your class because you cannot do multiple swaps. And it just turns out that Warlock in general is not as versatile as it was in Legion, and Demon Hunter is. So it comes down to basically overall output in the most scenarios possible.
Yeah. So it's like you've got like one total range slot, period.
Yeah.
Because it's only Demon Hunter and Rogue are almost a guaranteed because they're so good at everything. And it's like, well,
pretty much.
Do you need slow fall? Then here's your mage.
It comes down to like the meta right now comes down to usually like a double melee meta,
right,
which leaves only, like you said, one range slot open, and in a lot of cases there are the tank needs to live, like he needs to kite,
right,
or he needs 3 so that's like a mage or a boomkid for the control, and only in very specific scenarios will you see the Warlock being picked up. One example would be what Method NA ended up choosing in Temple versus us. They played Rogue, Demon Hunter, Warlock, while we played Rogue, Demon Hunter, Mage. I think that the Warlock is superior to the Mage, but since Jay didn't play the Demon Hunter, then I ended up playing the Demon Hunter, because the Demon Hunter Rogue is pretty much set from the start.
Right.
Okay, so here's a question: what makes Demon Hunter and Rogue specifically so powerful? Is it
Uh,
just their damage? Is it their utility, the way they deal the damage? What is it?
it is a lot about the damage. The output is very consistent, especially for Demon Hunter. You just have you always have damage. You there's never a situation where you don't have damage unless you screw up majorly. Warlock is much harder to play around when it comes to like you have to play around the cooldowns a lot, especially as Affliction, like your Dark Lair and Dark Soul Misery needs to be lined up, and it's hard. Like it's a lot harder to do that than to just go from pack to pack and like triple Garrett cleave, I beam, blade dance, everything down every single time. So that's it's the kind of damage where you have just like back to back blasts instead of lining up cooldowns over a longer period of.
Right. Well, that's unfortunate. So, I mean, it's really then not really a factor of Warlocks are terrible, the sky is falling. It's more of a factor of the fact that it's just you've got these two specs that are so incredibly strong that you always have those, and so things aren't going to get different until those two get kind of pushed down.
Would you two say that it's mostly just Havoc and Rogue specs that are a problem, or do you think if they nerfed those two, we would still end up in a double melee meta? I've seen a lot of people talk about things like Frost DKs being actually better than like their representation would suggest, and Unholy's obviously stupid in a lot of places, but
I actually think in a couple of dungeons you don't actually need a ranged DPS. You would actually just add the Frost DK, and that would be the way they deal as much, or if not more damage than the Demon Hunter. They just don't bring the 5% debuff, but they have a... You get a single grip, you get a combat res. If you choose to play with an alternate tank, or you don't have a residue or whatever. You can also control additional undead pets, which is actually a really big thing in several of the dungeons.
ooh.
Oh my god.
But they have some really disgusting damage on a 2-minute. And their damage outside of it is not that terrible.
Right. So, did you guys...
I agree.
Did you guys have any surprise? Like, did somebody bust out some a comp that like just surprised you during MDI? Was there anything that you're just like, I did not think of doing that?
Well, before we went on the tournament servers, it was only like a select few, I would say, kind of
Right.
lurking under the radar with the Festermite and Holy DKs, and then you just really saw what it's able to do on stage. With
That
just
300k
insane...
pull.
Yeah, exactly. It's disgusting, but it's been nerfed since then a little bit, but it's still
Has it?
yeah. The thing about Unholy DKs in particular, I don't think that you will see them in a lot of high mythic plus because you usually can't pull big enough for that to be better than just, like I said earlier, back to permanent damage.
Right. Well, and you've also got the Gahoon issue, and we'll get into that going away and what that's going to do to things later.
Yeah.
But yeah, so okay, so not really as many people had learned about the Unholy DK stuff up until they went and just did a bunch of damage. What do you guys think is the worst dungeon right now is for Warlocks in general?
What do you think, Gata?
Well, I always feel miserable in Waycrest, but you are actually pretty good on several of the bosses there, if you play it tyrannical. But the pigwig on the trash feels a little bit redundant.
Right.
I don't know. I don't feel bad in like any specific dungeon, really. I feel like Warlocks do pretty consistently the same thing in most of them. It's just that we don't bring things like 60% slows and exponentially scaling AoE, and you know.
Right.
Or burst AoE. Like you might say that, oh, I do really bad on overall in Wake Crest or Shrine or something along those lines. Those kind of dungeons. Siege might be another example. But overall damage doesn't necessarily mean dungeon speed, and you can bring, by killing the high HP targets and the bosses faster, you bring a lot of speed to the dungeon, even though it doesn't look like it on the overall meter at the end.
Yeah. If I had to
So-
pick one, I'd probably go with Siege as the dungeon that I pretty consistently do the least overall damage on. But that's because all of the trash dies so fast on most weeks in that dungeon that I just cry
Well, and then
every time.
we'll talk about this other thing. Is it is even worse in Tyrannical because the trash just instantly evaporates.
Yeah.
So there's just no burst AoE at all outside of the good old PS.
And then it comes back to like ranged classes, and a lot of ranged classes like boomkins, mages, warlocks, all of them have pretty long cooldowns. Like the 2 minutes and 3 minute cooldowns is what you have to play around to do damage, while the melee classes usually have the cooldowns as well, but they have a higher base. Like the burst baseline is a lot higher for most melee classes like Demon Hunters, Frosty Kiss. So that's what it feels like to me. It's just like the back-to-back consistent damage wins over the cooldown lineup.
I know I've recently picked up Balance Druid as a potential main for my guild going forward, just because we don't have any right now, and Innervate's really good and all that. But when I'm playing it in Mythic Plus, it's very much like you do a metric crap ton of damage once every 3 minutes, and then it just feels like you don't. All you're really doing outside of that is just like dotting things and hitting treants when your tank calls for it, and you don't really do much damage outside of cooldowns.
Right. Yeah, I think was it Atiku? Is that do you have a balance alt now? Is that the deal?
Yeah, it's my third character. I haven't played it a lot in Mythic Plus yet though, but it is like you said, it feels very empty outside the cooldowns, even more so than Warlock, because you don't have the same pressure to maintain agonies or anything like that.
Right.
And your dots are AoE applied very, very easily. Also, you only really have to pay attention to interrupting something with your solar beam every minute.
Right.
So it's less intense like that. You can obviously use Typhoon and other things as well. There are some other things to pay attention to that you don't have to as a Warlock. Maybe a little bit more attention to your party frame portraits, because you can have a decent impact there.
Treants.
Yeah.
Alright, well, we've established there are a couple dungeons that Warlocks don't feel great on, and that's usually dependent on how long trash lives or not in a key, and how much trash there is versus bosses. What are the dungeons that you actually think Warlocks are optimal in? I know earlier you guys had mentioned Temple. Are there any other dungeons, and maybe expand upon why they're so good in Temple?
Like Warlock Affliction in particular thrives in the sustained 4-5-6 target cleave dungeons compared to other classes, which Temple you cannot really pull that big a lot of the time. So Fortified Temple with the bosses dying basically in your cooldowns, and trash lasting long enough so that you can reach that flat line of AoE is really good. King's Rest is another example of a dungeon where you usually don't pull too big. But other than that, the sustained big AoE dungeons are also pretty good, like Freehold and Motherload. Also fairly good for Affliction in particular. You saw both me and Marvin playing AF in the MDI Allstars event in Freehold.
Do you play Destro or God forbid demo in anything, or is that just dead specs?
We only played two. We only played 2 games, so.
Well, I mean, okay, so not in MDI, but I mean in general in other dungeons. Are there other places where maybe Destro or even demo feel somewhat okay?
Tyrannical Freehold. I honestly think that Demonology is the best spec.
Interesting. Why is that?
Because you don't need, like, assuming that you don't need the interrupt, you have better back-to-back AoE potential, and your sustained single target is basically the same as F, slightly lower, over like 2/3. Like when the boss fights last for a little under 3 minutes, then Demonology can almost catch up.
Cool. So there is hope.
Yeah,
There is hope.
there's hope. Demonology does that better than any of the other Warlock specs. It's the only Warlock spec where you can consistently output AoE, right?
Right.
And that's a big thing in a lot of places.
And its burst is still very good.
Yeah. Would you say that not having the interrupt is a defining factor in not being able to play demo on a lot of dungeons?
It's the only factor. Like, you could play Demonology Warlocks could play Demonology and be at like the highest level of play, just playing Demonology, but you don't have the interrupt, so you die. You legit wipe because you don't have the interrupt when you try to go high enough.
That feels bad. Is that a factor also of, like, it feels like there's just more mechanics that have to be interrupted this expansion than we had in Legion? Does that feel...
I think it's more the case of that we're not bunching them up and max ranging them anymore and nullifying all their casts. I think Hov, for example, has as much interrupt as any dungeon now, if not more. If you would actually play the packs phase.
Okay. Which I think it's a good thing.
Mechanic. Yeah. Now you actually have to be scrappy and use almost everything in every class's arsenal to... I guess Motherload is a good example. Getting to the first... You almost have to use every single disable, interrupt, displacement on cooldown the entire...
And coordinate everything properly. So I welcome that change. I think it's a much better way of doing dungeons rather than just mass grip, stun and run away. Like, it's a much more, it really shows skill more so than in Legion. So I welcome that change, but it feels bad to just not be able to play a spec, which is the only spec that doesn't have a baseline interrupt. And then you can say, well, you can go Fell Hunter, but then you severely reduce the amount of output that you have, and then you are not viable from an output standpoint anymore.
I know one other thing that you had mentioned in the past being a defining reason as to why Demo's not performing as well as Affliction in a lot of these dungeons was actually not just the lack of interrupt, but also the fact that because Shadowbolt is much more powerful and important to Demonology as a spec because it generates shards every time you cast it, it has a much higher opportunity cost to be fearing things, right? Because when you're not casting Shadowbolt for Affliction, you're like, oh, okay, I missed a tiny bit of damage. But for Demo, you missed a shard, which is an imp, which is an implosion, right? Exactly. And fear's really big in a lot of these dungeons, like Motherload, where you can interrupt things like Hail of Fletches or whatever it's called from the Assassins, where they do the channeled AoE. You can't interrupt naturally through any means other than CC. And fear's really good in those places, right? Because you can just tap it.
Yeah. But in a lot of dungeons, there's not really a lot to fear. So, but Motherload is one example that it really comes to the forefront of, like, the fair disrupts. Freehold has some, but it's usually in most dungeons. It's like when everything goes wrong, then you will have to fear something. But that's fine in most situations.
Have either of you dabbled at all with Destruction and Mythic Plus recently? I know it was the big shit during beta and everyone played it, but it seems like now I'm one of the few remaining Destro Lock Mythic Plus players.
I played Destruction all day today, actually.
Oh my god.
How did it go?
Did you?
Well, it turns out that up until with my current gear, up until 13th, Shadowburn one-shots explosive orbs now with the change, the 50% HP nerf to explosives. So you are an explosive machine on until 11 to 13, depending on the amount of intellect you have.
Right.
Okay, so for the average player who's just trying to get their 10 done right now, on explosive weeks, maybe consider playing the spec just for Shadowburn if your group doesn't have, say, a Demon Hunter.
Like you can almost do as many orbs as, you can do infinite orbs basically. So
yeah, because every time you kill something with Shadowburn, the cooldown resets, so you can just spam it forever.
Exactly. So you have resource gain that way as well, which is nice. It still feels like it's very reliant on Infernal to do the big damage, and it's very lackluster in between. But maybe some Rolling Havoc stacking will change that. I haven't been able to test it properly, but just for today, when it comes to explosive in particular, it seems really nice actually.
Cool.
That's very very nice to know.
I know I've dabbled with Destruction quite a bit, even in higher end keys, and I'm not pushing anywhere near the level that you guys are, but 13s, 15s, something that's high for a normal player to be doing doesn't really have an incentive, right? It feels like it's way more dependent on affixes for Destruction to be a good spec than Affliction. In particular, there are a lot of things that carry over from last expansion too that just punish Destro so hard compared to Aff and Demo because of its lack of mobility. So playing Destro on volcanic or quaking weeks feels so unimaginably awful. It's so bad.
Well, I guess one thing to say then, though, is it at least adds a little bit of flavor that Destro might be kind of a pocket pick for a certain instance with these fixes that rolls. It's I'm talking for MDI and stuff. It means there's a bit of flavor there. I don't think it's necessarily the best thing, but it does add a little excitement. It's oh, it's a warlock. Oh, he's casting fire spells. What the fuck is this? It adds a little flavor.
I don't know exactly what the meta is for Underrot pushing, 19s, 20s, whatever people are doing now. But in the higher end Underrots I've done, it seems like Destro's a really good pick on that key, particularly on fortified Underrot weeks, because at least from a less organized perspective, it's very hard to pull a ton of mobs in that dungeon because there are just so many interrupts that can completely one-shot your group. So you end up a lot of the pulls in that dungeon end up being 3 to 4 targets, and that's where Destro really shines, it feels like. And then you have really insanely good single target burst for the bosses when they have less health on fortified weeks.
Does Havoc still cleave interrupts? It did in Legion.
With sacrifice. You need sacrifice to put the interrupt on you and not your pet.
That's at least nifty.
Interesting. I never even thought of that.
I know it did. I remember it did that for a while in Legion, but
yeah, but that's because you play sacrifice by default, right?
Right. You did for a while at least.
Yeah.
Well, that's nifty. Cool. So there is something. You sacrifice your infernal cooldown partially, but well, at least the single target portion of it.
Can have a mortal coil.
Yeah, that's so fun.
Spicy.
That's basically that's one of the only reasons Destro's even viable in Arena right now. Is just because you can Havoc Mortal Coil. It's great.
Cool. Well, that's cool. It's nice that at least Destro feels a little better now with just a weird change like the orb makes it super good for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I agree with Shelly on the point that it's too reliant on Infernal, and I would like to see it get nerfed.
Sure.
But I don't think that's going to happen. And as a more realistic approach, I think Destruction's really, really not a bad spec in Mythic Plus. You can play it at the high end in a lot of dungeons if you actually coordinate around the Infernal with your group. It's just it's even more cooldown reliant than Affliction, and that's already,
Pretty bad.
as we've mentioned previously in the discussion, too reliant on cooldowns, right? You're really looking for specs like Subtlety and Havoc that can just output consistent big damage, right? So I don't know, but
apparently the Mortal Coil Interrupt also adds stacks to rolling Havoc, which is kind of interesting. So there's
it's just
fun
cast
mechanics.
Rolling Havoc is just the number of casts that you execute during Havoc. So as many low cast time casts as possible is ideal.
That's
But
cool.
I think just buffing some of the bad talents for Destruction could take it from like that fringe, like not quite as good as Affliction, to actually better than it in a lot of places. Like, for example, if Shadowburn just got buffed and it didn't horribly gimp your single target to take Shadowburn in dungeons, it would probably be pretty good even outside of Explosive Week, and that would compensate a lot for on like Volcanic and Quaking weeks the lack of mobility, right?
Right.
If you could just take Shadowburn and not feel bad about taking Shadowburn, then it would greatly improve Destro's ability to do a lot of stuff in Mythic Plus. And just being tied to Cataclysm as hard as we are, if Fire and Brimstone and Inferno were actual options for sustained AoE, and you weren't just that like Cata CDF, you do all of your damage in 2 globals and then you AFK for 30 seconds and feel bad, it might be a lot better in Mythic Plus.
Okay. Well, this sounds like a good point because we talked about some stuff that's coming up. Mythic Plus going into 8.1. It feels like there's actually some changes coming in. First off, the first thing that's possibly coming up is the new affix Reaping. What is going on with this? What is Reaping? Shelly, go.
Well, apparently every 20% of the dungeon, every 20% of completed trash throughout the dungeon, stuff comes back from the dead and does stuff which we don't know what is exactly.
Wowhead put up an article a while back where they speculated on what some of the mechanics they might do are based on data mining from the PTR, and it seems like at the very least there's a mechanic that they want to work similarly to Infested in terms of slowing down your ability to just blow everything up. It's called Aura of Reaping, and it's similar to the Infested mechanic in that it doesn't apply to the target that has the buff, it applies to everything around it, right? So you want to focus this down because it gives everything in its proximity an aura that makes them reflect 75% of all damage dealt back to the target. Sub-Rogue, hit Shuriken Storm and then eviscerate it to death. I'm already seeing the exact same meta as live, except now even worse because instead of having Gahoons to slow down your ability to pull packs, that's just gone now, and you can just pull multiple packs consistently and not have to worry about that shit anymore, right? And then you get to this end bit here, and every 20%, the entire dungeon runs at you, and you just have your sub-rogue spam out some Shuriken Storm eviscerates into the dude to kill him off, and then you have your Demon Hunter AoE everything else down.
Or you make it so that you complete a trash threshold, and then you pull the boss, and then the ads come, and then you have double sub-rogue killing the boss with that.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
Or you could just shadow meld it. Maybe. We'll see.
Maybe.
Oh my god.
I really hope that they thought about that one, because if we get to live and you just see entire groups hitting Shadow Meld and then all the trash just despawns, that would be a great meme. I think that would probably top launch Freehold for biggest meme in this expansion's Mythic Plus. But they did hint, outside of this one mob, right? They hinted that there are at least 2 other mobs during interviews at BlizzCon, and we have no clue what they do, right? So all of this is just speculation for now. But
Right.
how does... Maybe let's talk about how you guys feel about Infested as a mechanic specifically. I know we had Pyre ask a question in the Q&A channel about it, and it basically, he just asks, how do you feel about Mythic Plus in general, and specifically Infested as a mechanic, seeing as we've been dealing with it for the entire expansion so far? A lot of people don't like it because it just feels kind of clunky. It just slows the dungeon down, and in a way that is very annoying and can just cause weird wipes if you miss one mob. Do you think it's a good mechanic, or how do you just feel in general about Infested as the seasonal affix?
I didn't like it initially, but since they made you able to fight multiple infested mobs simultaneously, it really adds a lot of things to think about when you're designing your pull pattern for a dungeon. I actually think it makes it more interesting. But if your Mythic Plus experience is weekly 10s, where you don't really want to spend much additional time into like preparing for it, then it's definitely gonna be a nuisance.
Yeah, I know from personal experience, pugging on alts just to try and get keys done for my 10, so I can get a nice big disappointment chest at the end of the week.
Yay.
I know the struggle that a lot of people have with Infested and Mythic Plus, because if you try to pug, oh my, it just compared to last expansion, it's a nightmare this time around to do your weekly completion, because people just don't know how to handle Infested at all. But I don't know. I feel like it's a step in the right direction as far as Mythic Plus goes, right? I don't necessarily think that Infested is the solution to make Mythic Plus not just, pull 5 packs and AoE them down.
It was a good
Stun
thought,
them,
though.
ignore the mechanics. But I like what it does, I just don't like how it goes about doing it, right? I like that for like last expansion, you thought about how you were pulling the dungeon a bit, because there are some packs that have very dangerous mobs and you don't want to pull multiple of them together and all of that. But you didn't really invest time and effort into how you were pulling a dungeon unless you were going for world first speeds, right? You just kind of did the dungeon, and usually you
Right.
completed it in time. And now, for the first time since Mythic Plus was created, groups are actually stopping and thinking about every pull in a dungeon and how they want to do things. And I like that. I like that there's a lot of strategy behind it now.
Yeah, I don't really mind Infested. I'm kind of with that on the fact that it adds a certain layer of complexity that you have to think about, and that you can play around, and it rewards smart play, which is something I
Always
like.
good.
Not just like who can do the most damage, but like who has the smartest pulls, the smartest pathing.
Cool. I mean, when you're going around this, do you design stuff or do you design your pulls to actively avoid the infested spots, or is that just part of, you know what I mean? Is it do you actively try and avoid those, or do you try and just line those up to certain pull packs?
Well, it comes down to like you look at, okay, we need this amount of percent in this dungeon. What
Right.
can we pull that is not infested?
Mhm.
That's the first thing, and
Right.
then you look what can we pull that is infested that's efficient to play. For example, playing multiple infested together, as Ada alluded to earlier,
Right.
is very efficient. So how can we pull as many infested together as possible that we have to do afterwards? Or if you can, like we did on Tournament Realm, CC infested and Shadow Meld afterwards.
Shadow Meld.
Shadow Meld.
It's actually like I honestly
Shadow
think
Meld.
I honestly think every single push group would be 100% Night Elves if people on Alliance actually played Mythic Plus.
Are warlocks aren't able to be night elves, are they?
No.
No.
Boy, this is awkward.
No. Can't bring warlocks. Feels bad, man. Can't be a night elf. Of all the reasons to not bring warlocks, it ends up being that one. Wouldn't that be great?
On the tournament realms? Oh my god.
No, but it was the thing on Tournament Realm actually. Like there was some dungeons we were doing. It's like I really want to play Warlock here, but I can't because I have to bring Shadow Meld. Because
I
the
think
strategy was built around it.
I think it's pretty amusing as well because I qualified to the first MDI while being on Alliance, so we actually did a bunch of Night Elf stuff, and there's a lot of nice uses for Shadow Meld, not just for skipping mobs. There's a lot of abilities from bosses and whatnot that actually get cancelled if you like easy example is like the second mini boss in Court of Stars, the beam. If for whatever reason you fail to lose it, you can just Shadow Meld and it stops. Same with
my
Feed the
God.
Weak on Shade of Saviors.
Jesus Christ.
Good times.
Nerf night elves is the moral of this story, right?
Little did we know that their plan to fix the faction balance was actually to make Shadow Meld imbalanced.
So,
Yeah.
so given what we know about Infested and how it alters the way that you guys decide to pull packs at the high end, and the little bit of insight that we've got into Reaping thus far, with the whole it spawns a bunch of spooky ghosts, they run at you, and at least one of them has a mechanic that makes nearby enemies reflect any damage they take. How do you guys think that's going to change the meta versus now? I know we memed a bit earlier the exact same, but do you think maybe we're going to switch from thinking very carefully about how we pull mobs together to more focusing on when we're pulling them relative to the total percentage and where we're killing them? So maybe, you want to pull mobs at the start of the dungeon out by the entrance and kill them there so they run at you for a longer time, space things out. Do you think maybe we're just going to end up stacking as many mobs as possible in one place and then bursting them down?
I was thinking, what if you, like they run from specific places in the dungeon. Like let's say they have spawn spots, but then you just go through the entire dungeon without doing any trash. For example, in Freehold, where you can do it, and then at the end you get 20% trash, and everything just chains into you, and you AoE everything at the end. For example, but like I'm just throwing stuff into the air here, but I think we will have like it's very hard to know how it's going to turn out. I think we're just going to have to wait and see what it actually does and what you can do to play around it, because everything that you do when it comes to these affixes is like, how can we make this affix not matter? Like that is the goal with every single affix. Like how can we just negate this affix?
Okay.
Cool. All right. So, I guess we can go ahead and start talking about some of the 7.1 changes, how we think these are going to start affecting things. First thing to talk about is we have some new Azerite traits. Let's talk about those. Shelly is excited. Shelly,
Yes.
why are you excited about our new Azerite traits? Do you not like Death Bloom?
Well, I mean, we get something instead of Death Bloom that gives you things when you play correctly, and that's nice.
Right.
So the big changes for Azerite on PTR, they're moving a lot of the least used or the ones that the community is the least happy with mechanically, and they're just removing them from the game, right? And in their place, they're adding new Azerite, and a lot of these new Azerite feel like they're a lot more interesting and playstyle defining than the ones that they're replacing. So for Warlocks, they took out Accelerant and Death Bloom, which are respectively the Rain of Fire and Seed of Corruption traits. And they also removed the Forbidden Knowledge trait from Demo, which is the Hardcast Demon Bolt one that absolutely no one has used the entire expansion, I guarantee. But they've taken those out of the game entirely, which is nice because all of those traits are just bad traits. They were never gonna be good. And they've replaced them with new, somewhat more interesting mechanics, all relating to soul shards. So I think we should talk about these in terms of their strength. So first, I want to talk about the Affliction one, which is called Pandemic Invocation. And it states that when you refresh Corruption, Agony, or Siphon Life with less than 5 seconds remaining, it will deal additional shadow damage and has a 6.66% chance to generate a soul shard. So basically what this is doing is reinforcing a mechanic called Pandemic that isn't explained anywhere else in the game. This is actually the first time that there's been a mechanic that explicitly does what Pandemic does, right? Up until now, it's just been like this thing that you kind of just have to tell new players about. Like, oh yeah, just
Read about
refresh your dots when they're at less than 30% duration, and it confuses the living hell out of them because they don't know what that means, right? Now there's actually a thing in the game that teaches players how to play Affliction properly, right? You refresh your dots just before they expire, and you get a chance at a shard, and it deals some damage, right?
Mm-hmm.
And apparently it's pretty good.
Yeah, it's pretty good. I'd say it's the best out of the three. It scales. It's probably not going to be like the #1 trait on single target just by how it works. But when it really shines is when you start looking at multi-target and things like sustained AoE with Creeping Death and Writhen Agony and things like that, where you're just constantly putting out dots on multiple targets and getting tons of procs off of this. It does a decent bit of damage single target. I think it was like 2 or 3% of your total damage, so it's pretty comparable to Inevitable Demise on live in that sense, where it's, you know, it's like 2 or 3% of your single target, and it's okay. It's not gonna blow you away. But then when you start getting more dots out, it starts scaling more and more compared to the other traits, right?
Right. You start feeling like a really shitty sub rogue at that point.
I think it's. Go ahead.
I'm really interested to see the demo one, to be honest. Like seeing how like it feels like I haven't been able to test it, but it just seems like it gives you more power in your 1.5 minute cooldown window, which I think can be really fun.
Yeah.
Well, it adds a lot to it because that cooldown is very rampy, right? It's not like most cooldowns are you use it and you're just like, yes, but like with Tyrant you have to build into it properly. And this kind of adds at least a little bit of instant benefit to popping your Tyrant, which is nice.
It goes decently well with the money consumption.
Mm-hmm. Which they've recently buffed, which is something that we can talk about now, I guess. But the demo changes. I haven't really played it in Mythic Plus, right? I don't have the Azerite for it. I don't have the gear, and frankly, I'm a Destro one trick, so you know, I just play Destro whenever I can. But they recently buffed demonic consumption, and it's actually not an awful choice now. On live, it's actually worse than not having a talent, and they made it at least like you can take it, right? I don't think it's at the current tuning going to be as good as Nether Portal or Sacrifice Souls, but it's at least an option if you're looking for that 1.5 minute burst window type of situation. Say on a fight like Fetid where you really need that burst on eggs. And this trait synergizes really, really well with those changes, right? And another thing that I love about it is that a very large part of its value is in the first trait. That 5 soul shard that you gain is huge. That's insane how much burst that gives you compared to what it was, right? It's not mostly from the tyrant damage itself. That's a nice added bonus, and it scales really well with demonic consumption. But just being able to hit tyrant and then spam out more Hand of Gul'dans, right? Say for like AoE pulls where tyrant's really not a good cooldown on AoE. It's really kind of bad. All that it actually does is just make like Grimoire Felguard last longer if you're running that talent, right? Which it does add a good bit of sustained AoE, but
it's not
a lot.
It doesn't matter as much.
But now you hit that button on PTR with just one of these traits, and you get 5 soul shards, and that's 5 implosions that you get to throw out, right? 5 imps dealing AoE damage. So it goes from this completely useless thing on AoE to actually being somewhat okay. I really love this trait, is what I'm saying. I think it's a good addition.
Cool. Let's talk about Chaos Shards. What's the... It seems like the proc chance is pretty low.
Yeah, you don't see this proccing very often on a single target at all. It's pretty weak at its current tuning, but I like the direction it's going. It scales really well with multiple targets, because one thing people don't really think about when they are playing Destro or looking at playing Destro is that it actually scales really well off of Immolate. Right. Immolate's really powerful. It's just not as powerful as Agony is, right? The power that you get out of Immolate in terms of shard gen is really good. So even on AoE, it's worth multi-dotting Immolate out on like 6 or 7 targets, right? So
and it has no diminishing return on the Ember.
Right.
Yeah. It just scales linearly with how many embers it gives. So shards, how many shards it gives. So when you're looking, I'm looking at this trait and I'm thinking it's not really meant to be a single target talent trait. I think it's more so meant for like AoE and Mythic Plus situations where maybe you want to be running Fire and Brimstone if they buff it, right? Well, if they buff Fire and Brimstone and you run this, it gives you Incinerate damage, which increases your Fire and Brimstone damage, and because you're spamming out Incinerates, you're getting a ton of shards, and then those shards each of them have a chance to proc this thing and give you more shards, right?
I still think that the 5% is pretty, like, that's like non-existent. You're gonna see like 4 of those in a whole in a fight, or like maybe 2 of them total in a 3-minute fight.
I think Destro averages, 35 Chaos Bolts in a 5-minute fight, so that's about 70 shards in 5 minutes, or 14 a minute. So you're looking at less than 1 proc a minute. You're looking at less than 1 proc a minute off of Chaos Shards, and that, I don't know.
I feel like if they bumped that to like 10% or something like that, it would start feeling like good. And then the Incinerate bonus is a thing that really will help with Mythic Plus, if F&B becomes an actual thing.
Which it hasn't yet.
Right.
But if you look at it in terms of shard gen, it's pretty comparable to Pandemic Invocation in terms of the number of shards you get a minute. But the difference is the value in Pandemic Invocation is mostly not from those shards. The
Right.
shards you get are actually not that substantial because you only get like
Well,
0.6 a minute or something, if I remember correctly.
well, and your damage isn't from. I mean, UA does damage, but that's not like the core of your damage at that point. It's just from the fact that you're dealing. You know.
Yeah,
your other
the
dots
actual
more.
most of the value in Pandemic Invocation is coming from the part that scales, the damage it deals itself. Whereas with Chaos Shards, it feels like you would have to buff the Incinerate damage by a lot to make it a good trait with the proc rate that it currently has. So I
Sounds
don't know.
like that would be weird. It would do
Yeah.
weird things to balance. So.
I don't think it's going to shake up the meta. I think Baleful Invocation and Pandemic Invocation actually have a decent chance to change the talents that you pick in some situations. But
Right.
Chaos Shards is just a little too weak, and Fire and Brimstone is just a little too weak right now.
Did we check if Pandemic Invocation procs off seed refreshes?
Yeah, I tried, it doesn't.
Does not. That's a shame.
Nope.
It's
Feels
probably
bad.
a good thing, but that feels bad.
Yeah. That kind of limits my hype for it a bit now. Actually having to refresh Corruption and Dungeons to get value out of this. Ooh, that sounds unpleasant.
Well, it's a 2-target thing for sure. It's gonna be really
Yeah.
nice for 2
Then
target.
you have to figure out the breakpoint where you would actually refresh.
Oh God.
No,
No,
Hey,
don't tell me
breakpoints! That
No.
B word.
No.
All right.
I don't want to have to think about that. I don't want to have to determine the optimal breakpoint for how many targets you spam Corruption on. Oh God.
Yep.
Okay, well, outside of the new traits that shake things up maybe a little bit, there is one big change to a mainstay of Warlock right now, and that's Inevitable Demise. And they completely redid this. Well, not completely, but they
fixed it.
switched it from Corruption to Agony, so it now procs off of Agony ticks instead of Corruption, and it's limited to a maximum of 50 stacks down from 100.
But it deals more damage per stack, so at least there's that.
As compensation for that, they increased the damage it deals per stack, and if you look at it from like a rating perspective, a throughput perspective, right? Just the total damage it adds during a fight, it's actually slightly better than it was before, because Corruption and Agony have the same tick rate, and there's not you don't lose that much from having to hit it more often because the stack cap is lower, and now
Shadow
it
Bolt
feels
doesn't do damage. Yeah,
Shadow
exactly.
Bolt, it doesn't do a lot of damage. It does a decent bit, but the opportunity cost of not hitting Shadow Bolt isn't that big. So having to use it more often is not that big of an issue in terms of raw DPS, and they increase the damage it deals. So it's actually slightly better than before for throughput, but it does severely impact its burst on fights like Fetid or Mithrax or Gahoon, where you could relatively easily get 70 or more stacks of Inevitable Demise going, and then just completely destroy an ad when it spawns, right?
There is a lot of new good use in the new raid as well already. And
Yeah.
with the new, like, with disregarding what the Mythic Plus pieces, Azerite pieces or dungeon pieces are gonna have on their second rings or whatnot, you can easily get like sudden onset, double racking, and triple ID of just raid pieces.
Right.
Yeah. I think it's a very important change that they made this, and Inevitable Demise is honestly one of the biggest complaints I've had about Affliction's power level since the start of the expansion. I personally, I've felt for a while now that like Dark Lair is really powerful, and that's true, but it's not obscenely powerful compared to things like Infernal and Balance Druids and Arcane Mages. There are a lot of specs that have pretty close single target burst to Affliction until you add Inevitable Demise, and then nothing even comes close outside of Arcane Mage. It's you have 100 stack and an ad spawns and you hit it and it deals like 200k damage in 2 globals, and it's like, what? I just had 100k DPS spike. Okay, cool. And it also had a lot of issues with absolute corruption, which is why you see that they changed it from corruption to agony after the Mithrax encounter.
Well, even without AC, it limits how quickly you can ramp up stacks, because you can't just instantly apply 10 agonies and have a couple ticks. Right. Well, that's what I mean, is you can't instantly apply 10 agonies at once, where you can do that with corruption still. So you can, I mean, in 3-4 seconds before, you could have suddenly 30 stacks, and, you know, you can't do that with agony. It's a health thing. It's less imbalanced, sure, which feels sad, but it's much more healthy in this state.
Like, for example, Affliction is the second best spec in the game on Zul. It does what Subtlety does with Inevitable Demise, just to a much lesser extent, because ID is nowhere as powerful as the Shuriken Storm setup, right? But
have you even killed Zul on your Warlock yet?
Yes, and I played Destro and I patted my heart out.
Oh, feels good.
Destro is actually pretty good.
Yeah, I can comment on that in a second, but Affliction's the second best spec in the game on Zul, because what it does is you just run triple ID and you Seed of Corruption off of the boss, and then you just ignore the ads completely, and your corruption just ticks, and you get like 30 stacks in a few seconds, and you're just constantly draining the boss. And now you're gonna have to be applying agony one by one to them, and agony does a lot more damage than corruption. So I think
it's healthier.
Are you not running Archive?
Hmm?
Are you not running Archive?
Oh no, sorry. Did I say 3? I meant 2.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, we're good. We're good.
You run 2 and then an Archive. My bad. But for the health of the game, I think Inevitable Demise was one of the most egregiously overpowered things in the game right now, and I'm glad that they changed it in the way that they did. As an aside,
it's really big for Mythic Plus, though. Like, the change it has to Mythic Plus is really, really big, because the reason why ID was so strong in Mythic Plus is because you were able to get stacks from your seed, essentially.
Yeah.
Press seed, detonate seed, get stacks. And it didn't matter if the ads started running away from you, because you could play Absolute Corruption for it. And you are much more like global capped in Mythic Plus on bigger pulls, so that you could being able to ramp up to 100 was not even enough then. If it could go to 200, you would still want it to go higher if it could, because you don't have the time to spend draining, because you're shard capped. You have things to dot. You have other things to do. Now with the change being 50 stacks in agony means that it basically shifts the power from where it was good before, and then it's not good there, but it's good other places. Like, it's going to be really good for the 3, 4, 5 target sustain cleave.
Right.
Yeah.
Like your Underrot, your King's Rest, your Temples, you're going to be really strong there, and then not so much in like the places where it was strong, which was like Freehold, Motherload, maybe Waycrest to some extent. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Also, can we get an F in chat for Toll de Gore? Rip Inevitable Demise, cheese. Never again.
Oh.
No more absolute corruption dotting up some cannons. Feels bad.
There's our F. All right.
I think we've rambled enough about Azerite.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, is there any other important changes that are coming? Warlock is now a destruction spell. That was a leaked change. Was there anything else?
Yeah, we can talk a bit. I know Shelly's probably the only high-end demo player on Earth at this point, so maybe he has some more context than we do for the upcoming demo changes and how they apply to Mythic Plus. The Blizzard really responded well to our feedback post that went up on Reddit and Lock One Stop Shop, which we'll talk a bit about later. But they gave most of the changes that we asked for, and I'm really happy with it. They buffed Bile Scourge Bombers, so the 15 row is a lot more diverse. You're not just always taking Demonic Strength on everything. Now you have Bile Scourge, which is basically directly comparable to it on any number of targets, including single target, and it's just half the cooldown. So now you have the option, do you want a bigger 1 minute cooldown or a shorter 30-second cooldown? That they both do about the same overall. They also, through the pet bug fix, indirectly buffed Soul Strike, which is really, really good for Mythic Plus. They gave Soul Strike a 15% buff.
Yeah,
And it's still considerably worse than Summon Vile Fiend for like sustained single target. You don't have to worry about that there. But it does make it more of an option if you're moving around constantly, or if you're doing AoE, where Soul Strike is just naturally better in Mythic Plus, right? Most of the time. And outside of those two, I think, are the ones that affect Mythic Plus the most. They also reshuffled the 100 tier a bit, and I think there are going to be a couple more upcoming changes, hopefully, to it to get the tuning just right. They really, really improved the 100 talent parity. They nerfed Sacrifice Souls a bit. It was honestly a bit too strong, maybe, for a talent. I personally feel like they probably could have left it and just buffed the other talents up to where it was, but I can understand it's just easier to nerf that one than to really buff the other ones. They did a lot of changes to Nether Portal. A lot of them. So on live, Nether Portal, it costs 3 soul shards, it has a 2.5 second cast, a 3-minute cooldown, and for 20 seconds every time you spend a soul shard, you summon a random demon from the Nether to help you. On live, there's a huge bug where the demons summoned by Nether Portal don't benefit from Demonic Tyrant. They don't get the extended duration, so they just despawn while Tyrant is up, and it feels awful.
That's
and it makes the talent literally half as good as it should be.
Yeah.
So they fixed that bug on PTR. They reduced the soul shard cost to 1, which makes it feel a lot better. It's not as big of a commitment to use Nether Portal now. And they also reduced the duration to 15 seconds, making it easier to get value out of it. And to compensate, they increase the damage that each demon does. And I think the biggest change for rating as far as demo goes is making Nether Portal a shorter duration. Because unlike other 3-minute cooldowns in the game, it takes 15 seconds now to spawn all the demons, and then you extend them by 15 seconds from Tyrant,
and then
and
you
it
have
just
the
takes
traits
forever.
5 shards.
Yeah, but
So,
it takes a long time because the demons take, what is it, 15 seconds? Sorry, it's the demons take 15 seconds to deal the damage. It takes 15 seconds to spawn all of them, and then Demonic Tyrant adds another 15. So it takes 40. It takes 45 seconds to get the full value out of Nether Portal, which is like, I think where it fits in is Mythic Plus mostly now, because that 45-second duration lines up really well with how long a lot of like fortified bosses last. So I think it's going to be in a similar place to like Darklair, not nearly as strong, but when things live for like a minute, maybe a bit more, you run Nether Portal and Mythic Plus and you get this big amount of boss damage in that time period, right? It's not really meant to like burst things like the other cooldowns are. which is interesting.
Well, demo in general is kind of built like it's like a faucet that you just slowly turn on, and then it just sits there for a while, right? Whereas a lot of other specs are like you take a water bucket and you throw it at people, and that's kind of how you have to look at the toolkit, is how do you make that faucet as strong as possible. So
yeah, I think after talking with some friends, and Shelly, I would really like your input on this since you're the only demo player here, but I feel like Nether Portal is probably going to be the default pick in dungeons now for demo, and I think it has potential to make it really good on some keys that it wasn't before. But I don't know. Maybe it's still just not good enough.
Having a 3-minute cooldown, I don't know how it's going to play out with like if you play Felguard with it, or if you play Inner Demons, because having a 1.5, a 2-minute, and a 3-minute cooldown can be hard to line up when you want uptime.
right.
Like you don't want to hold your cooldowns for too long.
Yeah.
So that's something, and then it's the new demonic consumption revamp, or like the buff.
Yep.
Maybe we'll end up playing that instead, and Sacrifice Souls got nerfed slightly. So
Well, I think the interesting thing about demonic consumption and Mythic Plus is that it's really only good on like those keys that we mentioned earlier, like Underrot and Shrine, where you're not doing big pulls. Because if you're doing big pulls, that just gimps you, right? Because it doesn't AoE. Your Tyrant doesn't. It's just a single target cooldown. So you're losing all of those potential implosions. So it's really like you take that talent if you want to nuke one thing down every 1.5 minutes, which is why I think it's like more applicable to raiding than Mythic Plus.
Probably, yeah. It would be very situational, but what I wanted to get at was mostly the Balscourge Bomber buff. The biggest problem is if you make them equal, then you will always take Demonic Strength, because Demonic Strength follows the targets.
That's fair, I guess.
Like that is like when you do keys right now, the tank will start kiting at some point to not die, and then you end up with your bombers just not hitting stuff.
Fair enough.
Same reason why it's hard to apply Destro sometimes.
Fire.
Exactly.
It's fine when you're doing low keys and things stay still because your tanks cannot die, but then you get into 19s and your tank's running in circles forever.
Yeah, exactly.
But I don't know. I feel like the Bioscourge Bomber buff at least gives an option for like, say you're doing like you're doing a low end, just like a 10 to get your weekly done, and things are, a pack's not taking more than 30 seconds. So maybe like now Bioscourge fits in a similar role to Cataclysm, where like, if you're doing a low end key where things are dying really fast, you just take this talent and every pack you get some damage out of it, right?
You mean CDF? You said
what?
Cataclysm. Did you mean CDF?
No, I meant Cataclysm.
Oh, okay.
Right. They're both 30-second AoE cooldowns, right?
Yeah.
It's the most comparable thing to it.
Sure. Okay.
I don't know, but like you said, I don't think it's going to have that big of an impact on the high-end pushing meta. But maybe
it gives some options, which is nice. Yeah. I mean, for all we know, we might just end up playing Sacrifice Souls forever.
Maybe there is some possibility of that, but I don't know.
Soul Strike buff is definitely welcome. Yep. It's heavily used in Mythic Plus. You need the mobility and flexibility that Soul Strike gives compared to the Vile Fiend is definitely something you use for basically all Mythic Plus, right?
Yeah, Vile Fiend has some extremely fringe niche uses, but it's some really weird shit in dungeons where like all you care about is the single target because you're I don't know. Playing demo in a group with like Havoc and DH for some reason, and your AoE doesn't matter, right? I don't know. There's weird situations, but the Soul Strike buff that is inadvertent is really welcome, and I don't know if they intended to buff Soul Strike, but I hope they did because it's. I feel like it's way too bad right now. It's like comparable on 2-target-ish and better on 3+, but it feels bad to not have it as an option for mobility and rating, right? Like just not
Yeah.
being able
Yeah,
to
it's
like
pretty bad.
like Vile Fiend is like 6% ahead or something on single target on live, and that's ridiculous. Like you just cannot justify taking Soul Strike in raid like ever.
It
But,
plays into the favor of what we talked yesterday. Target how some classes just have no cost, or just have like one baseline set of talents that are best for everything, and this takes it in a positive direction for them, at least in regards to that.
All right.
Well, outside of that, there aren't really many other Warlock changes on PTR to talk about.
Yep.
Some much needed
Let's-
demo quality of life stuff.
Let's talk about rolling back nerfs to classes that need nerfs. Gatto, what's your opinion on frost mages?
So I actually I didn't know that they reverted these until we came together yesterday for the pre-show and discussed it. I think Shelly brought up the fact, or maybe it was Ada, that just they completely reverted all of the nerfs that they made to AoE on PTR. When I saw those, I was like, great. The specs that have too much AoE and should be nerfed got nerfed. And then apparently they decided that, nah, it's fine. I was like...
To be honest though, the nerfs that were implemented were extremely minimal, and in some of the classes almost negligible. So maybe
Yeah,
they just thought that it wasn't the right way and they have something else in the works, but something needs to be done to a couple of those.
Like, I think you don't even have to look at Mythic Plus to see that burst AoE is an issue in the game right now. You just have to look at Uldir and see how like frost decays are at the bottom on Talic. They're like one of the worst specs in the game single target. And then you look at any of the fights with ads and they're just like #1, because why the fuck does Breath of Syndragosa and Dragon literally poop on everyone, right? Why is I-Beam as good as it is, right? It's just, there's so many, and it's all melee. It's every single one of the fucking issues is melee outside of Frost Mage, which really can't even compete with most of the melee if we're honestly looking at it. It's just like every melee spec has stupid burst AoE. I don't know. I feel like they have to address it moving forward, or the meta in Mythic Plus is going to stay the exact same, right?
Yep.
Like if Havoc DHs and sub rogues randomly do the same rotation, single target and AoE, and fucking crap on both consistently without cooldowns, then why are you playing anything else? Right?
Yeah, but at least they gave Demon Hunters a new trait that resets cooldown on I-Beam and Blade Dance when you use meta, so that you can I-Beam Blade Dance meta I-Beam Blade Dance. So that's nice.
Yeah, Havoc really wasn't good enough. So we needed to give them twice as much burst AoE, literally. What? What? I just... Dear God. Who's in charge of this shit? Oh, Christ. I don't know.
So
Okay.
that's fun. Anything
you-
we want to talk about with some of the other changes that are coming through to other classes?
Let's hit on the Frost Mage change a bit. So earlier in the PTR they nerfed the percentage. I could be wrong. I'm pretty sure. I couldn't find it, but I distinctly remember them nerfing the amount that Frost Mage is slow, right? But now when I look at PTR, it seems like they reverted that, and all that they did was make the slow shorter. They cut the slow in half, which doesn't matter at all because it's 8 seconds long now, and you just hit Blizzard and it applies. So it's like, what? Do you guys think that the Frost Mage slow is a problem? Do you think it's a problem that
I mean,
there are only there are only really two specs in the game that have slows, and that's Assassination and Frost Mage, and there's just nowhere else you can get it outside of like Fury Warrior, which no one's gonna play that. But
I don't know.
like, do you think that it's an issue that slows are as powerful as they are, or do you maybe think it's more so that there's just not an availability of slows in the game?
I feel like they pruned a bunch of them, and then they just kept these couple ones around to add flavor, and turns out that, it's a really good ability. It's like really good. It turns out your tank taking no damage because he's able to get away from mobs is a really good damage avoidance mechanic.
Yeah.
So
I really feel like it's very equal to the state of things that we had in Legion, where it was Warlocks. We had the slow ring. It was permanent slow on everything, and now you have Frost Mage, which is permanent slow on everything, and no one else in the game had that in Legion apart from Warlocks, and no one else has that now.
Well, Assassination has a slightly worse. It's just worse.
Yeah, it's the thing is you need a difference between your tank's movement speed and the mob's movement speed to be large enough to run away. So that really only leaves Frost as like the only real option. So it's a niche thing that Frost Mage has that makes them very, very powerful when it comes to being able to do bigger pulls in Mythic Plus, which in turn speeds up the dungeon because fighting 10 mobs instead of 5 mobs at once is faster.
Alright. Well, I think we all knew that it was a powerful effect that is very good on things like Necrotic Week, but do you think it's a good thing that it's maybe limited to just Frost Mage? Like, it's their niche, they don't...
I think that if...
Do you think that they would still be brought to keys without having that at all? Like, if they just removed it, would Frost Mage still be a good spec, or is this like a defining aspect of it?
I think
it is the defining aspect, I think, but it would... I don't know how, like, I don't know if it's fair or not fair. I wouldn't say that it's completely unfair, because you can say that, but Warlock, for example, brings Hellstones and Soulstone and Gateways and insane single target priority damage and stuff like that, self-healing. So why should we have all of these utilities, but Mage doesn't get anything? So
I think it's fair, personally, that Frost specifically has access to this big constant slow. It really plays into their spec fantasy. But I do think that maybe there should be more access in other places to slows, not as strong as Frost Mages, but more along the lines of Assassination's 50%, right? It just like, if they gave more slows that were smaller, you couldn't just kite in circles forever with it, but if your tank needs to run away for a second, they can run away, right, and reset their necrotic stacks. I don't like that it's so limited to just Frost Mage. Like, Vile Taint is 30% slow, but it's half uptime. It's garbage. Like, that's like one of the only other slows in the game. You have Fury Warriors who have an AoE slow 50%, I think. It costs 10 rage, though, for no reason. You have Assassination with the 50% slow from Crippling Poison. Then you have Vile Taint, and I can't think offhand of another slow. Blood Decays, I think? From, like, they have a talent?
Death Decay is pretty strong. Blood Paladins have almost 100% uptime on slow.
Consecration.
Death and Decay has like 70% uptime. Depends on procs, but on average.
I think it's something that should be more attached to tanks than DPS classes.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
I think that's something, because it's at that point it's a tank mechanic, right? It's the whole point of it is so that your tanks can avoid damage. So I understand why it's class fantasy for frost mages, but I think frankly it should be something only attached to tanks. And all tanks should have some way to slow things. Like Thunderclap used to do it a while ago. Bear Druid had a way to do it. I don't know if they still do at this point, but in my opinion, it should be strictly only attached to tanks, and it shouldn't be 100% uptime either, because that avoids the decision making. It's like, oh, don't forget to drop your slow so that you can keep running like a Mongoloid, you know.
It's fair that it's part of the Frost Mage class fantasy, but I don't think the permanent, like the no DR, like no cooldown slow, I don't think that should be 65%. I think the consistent slow should be weaker, and then I think they should have the option to apply a stronger slow periodically.
Yeah.
Right.
Cone of Cold already exists. It's already 75%, I think, right?
So cut off like 30% of each of those numbers, and
and I think that what they had done originally, which was Frozen Orb went down to 30% for 3 seconds. Blizzard was only 1.5 second duration. That makes sense, because it's like, hey, we can apply this for a bit. Things can move out of the range, and once they're out of the AoE, then the slow's off, basically, right? And that makes sense to me for DPS classes to have, and it just needs to not be something permanent.
All right, I think we've beaten that horse enough. I think we should move into the soapbox portion of the podcast and start winding things down a bit.
For sure.
So we talked about the demo changes coming and how they might have a bit of an impact on Mythic Plus. There are also some pretty big shakeups to shamans, to shadow priests, to marksmanship hunters, and even a bit of a rebalance for balance druids. If you guys had any time to look at any of those changes, do you think anything's gonna shake up the meta in the next patch because of these big scale changes to specs?
I think Elder Shaman might see some play. I've already seen some positive things from it, even without the new patch buffs.
Okay, are we talking about
So
Mythic Plus
it has some
or
decent Mythic Plus?
Yeah.
It has some decent potential in some dungeons.
Earthquake's pretty good?
Yeah.
It's very good for the
Also-
mid-range keys, or like the MDI keys, where things are just standing, like you go in and then you blast for like 20 seconds, and then you move on to the next thing, which is like the MDI way of doing things. Like you go big and you stand still and face tank.
It also has a periodic AoE slow, knockback, AoE low cooldown interrupt. Ticks quite a lot of boxes to make it good.
Seems good.
It's just I mean, in Legion it does have the same issue. It has similar issues to Destro Warlock, where if you start kiting, then you're gonna lose uptime on your AoE, which was probably the main reason why you didn't see any of it in Legion, because you were kiting all the time.
Yep. Okay. Well, I know personally I've looked at the balance changes, and I feel kind of weird about them in Mythic Plus, because changes for rating, they basically moved power out of Moonfire and into single target by buffing the mastery and nerfing Twin Moons. And that means that balance should be doing a bit less damage on trash than they were before, but way better damage to bosses, like 5% or so more damage single target. So it's kind of weird from a Mythic Plus perspective, because it shoves them even more into the niche that they already had, where they're kind of just like utility on trash, and then they destroy bosses really hard. So I don't know how to feel about that.
They changed high noon and power of the moon to buff the periodic damage instead of initial damage of Sunfire and Moon.
Yeah. To my knowledge, though, those traits were already bad, weren't they? Yeah, I haven't seen anyone running them even in Mythic Plus.
I think
But-
I think if you want to change the meta right now, like you need to change the amount of damage that casters do in between their cooldowns to be able to somewhat match what the melee cleaves can do in between cooldowns, because that's where you are lackluster. Like as Affliction, for example, you go into a pack, you have your DSM, you have Dark Glare, you just fly, you do so much damage, and then on the next pack you're just lackluster because you don't have anything, while the classes that were doing slightly less than you on the previous pool are doing the same as they were on the previous pool on the next pool, and just go back to back to back. So something needs to be done about the way casters do damage in between their cooldowns, or I don't think we're going to see a lot of casters in tournament setting, at least.
Have you guys looked at the shadow changes at all? I mean, everybody has for rating because it's the new hot shit, but
Yeah.
But in the context of Mythic Plus, I'm really interested in the shadow changes because it is exactly what you just talked about. It just doesn't have cooldowns really. All of its cooldowns are 1 minute long. You just constantly do the same damage pretty much. So I
haven't looked at it. I haven't looked at it, but maybe that can be something.
I've seen a couple Shadow Priests on live doing really well in Mythic Plus. Like, not as good as, Melee are, but they can do some pretty substantive burst AoE with Warlock abilities. The Ascension talent on the 100 row, where they just instantly pop into Shadow Void form. But, I don't know. Alright, well, the upcoming changes, there might be a bit of a shakeup, but what do you think outside of moving damage out of cooldowns and into the baseline for casters? What do you think else needs to be changed? Like, do you think there are specific specs that need nerfs? Like, is Subtlety too good? Is Havoc, Frost DK, Unholy DK, etc.? What's on your hit list? What stuff do you want to see gutted next expansion or next?
I really want to see consumables added for the physical and magic damage taken debuff. It's pretty ridiculous that doesn't exist when every other thing. I think even someone's told me the other day that there's even gonna be like an engineering combat dress item. So that's not even unique anymore for a class to bring, but
that is strange. That's the only one that's not consumable.
I'm not really sure exactly what they need to do to demon hunters to make them less dominant and more of like a choice rather than being borderline mandatory.
I don't know. I think the biggest issue with Havoc is that you just don't change how you play at all between single target and AoE. It's just that all of your single target buttons incidentally do a crap ton of AoE damage. You're using I-Beam and Blade Dance single target already, and it just like you just consistently do the same thing on everything in the entire dungeon. So I don't know.
I just want to get rid of exponential scaling AoE, like Bursting Source and Frozen Orb. I want to get rid of sub-rogue priority damage because it's silly, and I want to get rid of absolute corruption, and then we're good. Then we fix the game.
Make it less. Make the priority, like the priority damage is a good niche. Enhancement Shaman also has that niche.
It shouldn't be 250% increase damage.
Obviously, like you shouldn't go look at a Zol log and see that one rogue is dealing equivalent damage to like 3 people. Like that shouldn't be a thing. But it should still be a niche.
Now it's only 2.5.
Okay, sure.
If you actually look
2
at
rogues equals 5 people, so, keep your
high
facts
end
straight.
The high end of subtlety is about 45k, okay, on a single target output, and it's about 20k for most other people. It's about 2.5.
I remember doing the initial PTR test on Sol, and I was like, is this really going to happen?
Yep.
It's
And
going to happen.
Sure,
And then it did.
and it was even worse than I thought it would.
Feels bad.
We just had, for us, we just had like 3 people log their rogue alts, me
Yep.
included, and neither of us 3 had really like put any time whatsoever. We got some,
Nope.
we just got basic rotation explanation, and then we killed the boss in sub 15 attempts.
That's
God.
that was the best part about it for all of the people who re-rolled subtlety just for Azul, like me and you, who had never in their life touched sub. I fucking hate that spec, and I never want to play it again. But I just log in, I get to Zul, I haven't really played the spec at all, and I just start hitting buttons, and it's like, oh, you literally just hit Shuriken Storm and then Eviscerate, and that's it for the entire fight. That's all you do. You just hit those 2 buttons, alternating them back and forth, 1 2 1 2, and you do 45k. Feels good.
Yeah, any sort of complexity the spec has with the random combo point proc, or not the random one, the one you get of auto attacks, is completely removed on AoE as well. So the only thing you need to look at is your Shadow Dance charges, your Shuriken Tornado, and your symbols, and keep Nightblade.
And I think to a big extent, the reason that I slept personally on Subtlety and Mythic Plus is because the way that people explained it to me during beta was that, like, oh yeah, you use Shuriken Storm and Eviscerate, and you pump a bunch of damage into one guy. And nobody bothered to mention the fact that fucking Techniques exists, and it just does, like, insane AoE damage. And it's basically just death from above, but better. I don't know. Haven't they already nerfed Subtlety on PTR? I think I remember them nerfing.
Yeah, Shuriken combo is going down from 8% per stack to 5%.
Well,
And
that's a
they're
good
also,
change.
they're
didn't know.
nerfing. They're completely remaking First Stance, the trait which gives you a huge crit bonus to your first 2 spells in Shadow Dance.
Oh man, I have 2 of those at 385, and I love shitting on one because I got lucky.
Although I'm not really sure how big it's gonna be, because someone pointed out to me that the extra haste you get from First Stance now probably makes you able to play Night Stalker, so that might not even change anything. But the Shuriken combo is something.
Yeah, it's something. It's still not far enough because Shuriken Storm is just mechanically broken, right? Like it's the only, not the only, but it's one of the only AoEs in the game that scales linearly or better, right? Almost all AoE mechanics in the game get slightly worse as you add number of targets, right? I phrased this wrong. It's one of the only mechanics in the game that you can use AoE to funnel into a single target and have it scale linearly. Right? So every single target you add up to, 4 or 5, you just gain linear damage increase to your single target. And that's a fucking problem. So I don't know. But
Alright. Is there anything else we wanted to cover? Maybe do a quick recap of what you think is going to be like going into next Mythic Plus season. Speculations, anyways. 2 rogues, Demon Hunter for your DPS.
I think Monk could become good at any point again. It just needs like some slight changes to it. It has like all the utility and mechanics are there for it to be good.
It just needs AoE right now.
And a slight nerf to Demon Hunter.
And okay. Well,
so
not too much. Not too much because I play it now. So.
So Monk, Rogue, Demon Hunter is the next meta. Is that the...
Look out for the Elder Shaman.
Ooh.
Have you looked at the monk changes at all on PTR? They don't actually fix the AoE situation, but it does at the very least move damage out of Touch of Karma and back into the base kit, which is healthy for the state of the game, but I'm not sure how. I think that's probably actually a nerf for Mythic Plus in a lot of cases. I don't know. I haven't really played Windwalker at all, but
Would really like for them to take enough power out of Karma so you can actually feel like you have the option to spec Ring of Peace again, because Ring of Peace is...
well, they cut it in half. And I think they cut it in half again. Wait, what is it now? What is it now? It's fucking... Move. You guys can talk about something else while I look this up. It's
I'm kind of curious to see how like gear scaling will like affect the balance between the Warlock specs in Mythic Plus, especially like to me it feels like the more gear I got, the better destruction became. I don't know if that's just me stopping shit at destruction or if it's actually the case. But...
I think a large part of it is that destruction feels really bad to play when you have low haste, right?
Yeah.
Affliction has some issues at low haste where it can feel sluggish, but Demo and Destro feel fucking bad to play when you have low haste. Like, they're just unenjoyable specs until you get a good bit of haste. And now we're getting to that point where we're starting to have enough, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I don't know. Destruction has some interesting scaling.
Because the Infernal is so strong right now, being able to do that kind of AoE DPS on a 3-minute cooldown might make it playable for tournament setting. Like if you're doing a pull in a tournament setting where you need to output a certain amount of DPS to a lot of targets, then Destruction might make that happen better than basically any caster.
Like the Marv sub, or
yeah, for example,
where you have like a certain time frame, you kind of need to kill it, otherwise you fall.
Exactly. Like I don't know of any other deep. It's possibly Mage has similar like 30 second window, but the destruction is definitely up there. So I'm curious to see if that's gonna become a thing, or if we're gonna be playing Athlete for the rest of our lives.
You know what worries me about Reaping? Is that it sounds really good. Like, oh yeah, about like every 3 minutes, you know, you get that 20%, like maybe every on an interval of Infernal, and then you drop it, and then we find out that the fucking Thorns mechanic doesn't get the 90% AoE reduction for pets, and then your fucking Infernal just kills itself instantly. That would be
you
great.
Stun the mobs, but no Infernal actually shows up. You're just like...
Infernal just pops down and it hits everything once and then dies. That would be beautiful.
I just hope that this is up on PTR for like a week or two, because otherwise this is going to be very weird. Like there's just going to be no mass testing to it at all, and it's going to be a clown fiesta again.
You mentioned gear scaling as well. It's gonna be interesting to see what classes have like an initial power gain from 2 rings of traits, because not all classes have like 2 good traits, and there's no a lot of classes rely on neutral traits at the moment. Whereas Affliction is a good example, has like 4 or 5 really good traits. You don't really mind. You don't mind that much which one of them.
There actually just aren't any bad ones anymore. I'm pretty sure
like our
that
Legion legendaries. It's like
I'm pretty
just
sure
no bad
that
ones, dudes.
I haven't checked the numbers on it yet because I'm still implementing stuff for Affliction on PTR. But I'm pretty sure with that Dreadful Calling buff, it might actually just be a good thing now. So literally every trait might be good for Affliction at this point, which is nice, I guess. It's like the only spec in the game that has mechanically diverse traits that actually change the way you play the game and also are all good.
Right.
But as far as the last thing to hit on here, the scaling, it might feel like Demo and Destro scale really well, but you're gonna find probably really quickly that it's still just Affliction, because Haste and Mastery for Affliction are still so disgustingly overpowered compared to what stats are for most people. So it's, I don't know. When Affliction has more Haste and Mastery later in the expansion, it's gonna start doing silly things again.
On Tournament Realm, when I was doing sims on Tournament Realm on as Affliction, and I kept thinking to myself, there must be, like, at some point, like, haste and crit. No, I mean crit and verse are gonna, like, be worth something. And it's like, no, just keep stacking more haste and mastery, just all the haste and mastery.
I'm not exaggerating. The optimal set for Affliction, I tested it, because obviously I did. I'm a fucking nerd. That big of a nerd.
Yeah, you are.
I tested with theoretical stat distributions that you could never get on gear, and the optimal setup for Affliction right now is 0 crit and 0 versatility. Like, if you could remove all crit and verse from every item on your gear, you would do it while you're playing Affliction.
That reforging mechanic would be pretty handy right now, wouldn't it?
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we've hit all the topics we wanted to hit. I'm gonna quickly get on a little soapbox here about my post. Recently, about a few weeks ago, I put up a post in conjunction with the WoW Reddit team, just giving feedback on Warlock in general and how I and the other people in the leadership of the Warlock Discord feel the specs could be improved greatly. A lot of those changes have already made it into PTR for Demo, and honestly, I'm so happy with the Demo changes. I couldn't be happier. But there are still a lot of big issues with Affliction and Destruction as far as talent balance goes. There are just some rows that are so bad, like the tier 15 row for Affliction, where Nightfall is less than a 1% damage gain, and Drain Soul literally makes you do less damage than if you didn't have the talent equipped. That there is something fundamentally wrong with that needs to change when there's a talent that actually in some scenarios makes your damage lower than just not having a talent at all. That's a major issue in my mind. And I think that if you just buffed a lot of the really bad talents for Destro and Affliction, it would be much more well-rounded as specs. And I don't know, like a lot of the issues could be resolved with Destruction, for example, if the optimal talent setup wasn't just always every single talent that favors burst. If you weren't literally always running Flashover, Reverse Entropy, Kata, Grimoire of Supremacy, and Dark Soul Instability on everything, no matter what you're doing, outside of some stuff in Mythic Plus where you can use Channel Demon Fire, it would probably feel a lot better, right? I've actually tried playing with the worst talents, things like Internal Combustion and Roaring Blaze, and things like that are less cooldown based and more consistent damage, and it really does feel so much better. Infernal still feels powerful, but you feel like you can actually deal damage outside of it, whereas it's just worse DPS right now, right? So if you buff things like Internal Combustion and Roaring Blaze and Soulfire so that we have more diversity on the talent tree, it will resolve a lot of the things that people are feeling where they just hit Infernal and do all of their damage and then AFK for 2 minutes, right? I think that's a large part to do with the talents. So based on the PTR changes, I'm going to be redoing a lot of my posts. I've already written most of it. It'll be up in the next few days. It will get posted on all of the relevant social media. I'll throw it up on my Twitter. It's going to get posted to the Warlock Discord. But the general summary of my proposed changes is just make the Affliction and Destruction talents that are terrible not terrible, and that makes the game more fun to play. It's a pretty simple request, I think. But
And fix the pet damage.
yeah. Oh god. The pet I actually want to commend them on that because they did an excellent job fixing the pet bug.
Yeah.
For anyone who might not know, quick TLDR, there's a bug on live servers. Pets scale twice off of haste because reasons. It only applies to Warlock pets, don't worry, hunters. And they fixed that on PTR, and obviously that caused a big damage change. Because when 15% of your damage scales off of haste twice, things are a bit wonky, right? So it was like a 5% nerf to destruction to just fix that bug, and they rebalance the pets in a way that actually they're really good now. Like Fell Hunter and Succubus are above Imp slightly because Imp's a ranged pet, and it should be slightly worse because it doesn't have to run around like an idiot. Voidwalker's actually a bit better on AoE than it was before. I think the breakpoint's like 1.4 targets now for
That's good.
Blueberry to beat the other pets. So
Blueberry.
like if you don't need an interrupt in Mythic Plus now, it really does a lot of damage on PTR, right?
It's good to know.
So they did a really good job rebalancing the pets, and I want to commend them for that. But there's still a lot of work to do with Destro and Affliction talents, and I worry that because Affliction and Destruction are in a good place right now numerically in Uldir, they're probably not going to get any changes, right? Because Blizzard tends to only fix things when the spec sucks, like Ellie and Enhancement, right? They only fix things when your only options when you're playing a shaman are to reroll to another class. So, I don't know.
Oof.
But
Cool. All right. Is there anything else we wanted to talk about before we head on out of here?
quickly go over just a couple quick pointers from the Q&A channel. Maybe explaining why it took us so long to get around to this podcast, Taryn.
Oh, simply because I'm in a master's program and working 50 hours a week right now, and I feel like jumping off a bridge at any point during the day. And this is the first time I've had a free weekend, so yeah. I was meaning to do this last week, and then I ended up working 60 hours last week, so didn't happen. It's simply I will have more time to do these once I'm done. Once I graduate in May. I'm still going to be trying to get more of these done, try and commit to at least one more coming in December, and try and get one every month to month and a half from that point on. So, and Gato will help hound me and yell at me when I'm not actually doing anything, and it'll be good. So,
Yep.
if you
Kind
want
of already hit on Pyre's question, and a lot of the other questions from the channel I just tried to incorporate
Right.
throughout the show notes, but there was one interesting thing that we can maybe just wind things down, the very last thing of the podcast. What are some of the biggest mistakes, or not biggest, but the most common mistakes you see Warlocks making as far as Mythic Plus goes?
The biggest it's I've said this multiple times on my stream, and when people ask like what am I doing wrong, and usually apart from like small mechanical stuff like missing agony, stuff like that, like just use your cooldowns on cooldown.
Yep.
It's the biggest one for almost every single Warlock that I see play when I check logs or look at videos or something else. It's like you think that you, for example, for Affliction, you think that you need to have Dark Lair and Dark Zone Misery for every single boss on pull. You don't. You just need to you obviously you want to line it up so that you sometimes you have it with lust, or you learn the timings of the dungeon so that you get better usages. But it's almost always better to just use cooldowns on cooldown rather than holding.
I think that's particularly big when you're first learning a dungeon. Like, a lot of people get into a bad habit at the start of the expansion by just going into a dungeon and hyper focusing on needing Inferno for boss and needing Dark Lair for boss and always trying to have it. And they don't really think in their head, like, okay, but the boss is 3 minutes away, so it doesn't matter if I use it right now. People, myself included, oftentimes don't have a good internal gauge for how long it's going to take you to get to a boss, right? So it's oftentimes better when you're learning a dungeon to just, whatever pack you're on, just pop your cooldowns on cooldown and then see where they come back up, and then maybe the next time you run the dungeon, change what you're doing from that, right? So if you see that if you use it on cooldown here, and then it comes up like just after a big pull, maybe you want to delay using it for that big pull, or etc. But the biggest thing is not using Dark Lair. Like, just, it is actually a very meaningful AoE cooldown if you just pop Phantom Singularity into Dark Soul Misery Dark Lair. Like, it does a lot of AoE damage, and people just don't do it because they only think about Dark Soul or Dark Lair when they're looking at bosses, right?
Yeah. No, it's definitely the biggest thing that I see.
I'll also say that another thing that, I mean, at the lower end that you see a lot is always be casting ABCs. Always be doing something, even if, like, if you're moving, like, refresh something, find an instant cast that you can make sure you're using, and the instant you start standing still, there needs to be a priority list of, like, okay, this needs to be casted, like, immediately when I stop moving. And try not to panic, at least when you're first starting out and learning like, if you're starting off as a warlock, something like that, try not to have that button overload panic that you get when learning a new class. Like, always just try and drill it in your head. Just be doing something. Doing something is better. That's wrong. Is better than not doing anything.
Yep. One other thing that's kind of related to the point of just using cooldowns on cooldown is that if you're in a group with, like, your friends, and you're in voice comms or whatever, you know, you're taking your time pull to pull, talking in chat if you have time to. If you're in a situation where you're not just pugging with random strangers, make sure that you're, like, telling the people in your group when your cooldowns are coming up so that they can adjust their play around it, right? Like if Infernal is coming off cooldown and you're 3 minutes out from a boss, it will be up for a boss. Make sure you, like, let your tank know, like, hey, I've got a really huge cooldown coming up. Maybe pull 2 packs here, right? So that you're not end up using Infernal on a pack of 2 mobs, and that feels awful. But
cool.
You know.
Adam, anything?
I had something. No, it just got me thinking about, but it's not relevant to this, about Seed of Corruption not exploding if you're CC'd when it...
Yeah, please fix that. Please fix that.
Oh, yeah, that's a good note to end the show on. Holy crap, remember that bug that everyone found out about on Gul'dan last expansion and never had to worry about before that? Yeah, if you get crowd controlled while Seed of Corruption is out and the seed detonates while you're crowd controlled, it just doesn't do anything at all. It doesn't deal damage, it doesn't apply corruption. It's like, what? How did this happen? How does that code work? Like, God damn. Please fix that, Blizzard.
2 years later.
I guess something is to not be afraid to go out of your comfort zone if you have, like, inefficient key bindings or anything like that that just constantly cause troubles for you to actually execute like the basics of the specs, then don't be afraid to change it. It will take you a couple of days to get used to them, but it's gonna be worth it for sure in the long run.
Yeah, that's something else, is try and always figure out if there's a better way to map your keys out. Having more things on the keyboard means you're going to be hitting them quicker. Like, don't click anything outside of, like, summon gateway. And
that's a lesson that I learned the hard way when I started PvPing back in TVC. I learned really quickly from a lot of the higher end PvPers that keybind mapping saves a massive amount of thought. Like, it just reduces the amount of things that you have to think about in a fight by a lot.
You can shift modifier, control modifier things, and, you know, keep that in mind. Like, you can map, like, 30 spells with, like,
10.
3 rows of things.
Yeah, you feel awful and awkward and clumsy for a day or so if you do a lot of keybind changes, but eventually it just becomes automatic.
The tilde key is a thing for if keep that in mind. The tilde key is right there. So all right,
I think this is where we end it.
Okay, Ada, any closing anything that there we go. Ada, anything you want to say before we leave?
While it may look a little bit dark right now, don't give up hope.
Your camera is very dark.
Don't stop maintaining your agonies. Make sure they stay up. Don't drop your poor agonies. They want to stay on there.
Oh god. All right.
All right.
Shelly, you have anything you want to pimp?
Well, I'll be streaming afterwards, so if anyone wants to come hang out after this podcast, just come on over to my stream and
great.
I'll make sure to talk shit about Terran and
Excellent. All right. Gato?
Hopefully I get to be a warlock next year. We'll find out.
All right. And yeah, I will. I'll make sure that we get another one of these on the books for mid-December, and we'll see you guys next time. All right.